Thank you all for being here. I'm Kristen Daly, the Executive Director of Global Washington. And there's a lot of new faces in the room, so just briefly, Global Washington is a membership association. We have 165 members that are nonprofits, for-profits, academic institutions, and foundations that have a presence in Washington State and do work to improve lives in developing countries. So what we do is connect, promote, and strengthen our members. So we try to raise the profile of our members and their work and the issues in global development. This month, we're focused on economic empowerment of women, and we're working with our members that we have here today, and they've told me that there's actually a unique aspect of economic empowerment of women that really can lead to more civic engagement and decision-making power, so empowerment of women in different areas. So that's the topic that we're looking at today, and this is part of a broader issue campaign that Global Washington is doing throughout the whole month. We'll have some videos that we'll post online, our newsletters coming out. We have an issue brief that you all have at your chair, and we also list all of our Global Washington members that work in this area. This issue campaign will roll up with all of our other issue campaigns during the year into our annual conference that we have in December. And the theme of our annual conference this year is around wicked problems, really looking at the complexity of the problems within developing countries and the savvy solutions that our members are really tackling. So for today, we are doing social media. You can do hashtag income and voice or hashtag next10global. We are videotaping, so for your friends that couldn't make it here today that are interested, it'll be posted on our website, so you can send them the link as well. So, I also want to recognize that we have Oxfam on the panel, of course, but we also have the President and CEO of Oxfam America with us today, Abby Maxman. Thank you for flying in. And Abby will be giving some remarks at the end of the presentation today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Gillian, who's the Program Manager, Managing Program Director at Resource Media and one of our experts in the field here in Seattle to moderate the conversation. Teresa.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I love all female panels. Hooray for us. So today we want to talk about economic empowerment of women and how that connects to increased political participation. And some of these things sound really easy on paper, like, voila, that sounds great, sounds like a perfect direct line. I think those of us who've worked in development for many years know that a lot of times it's a little more messy than that. You know, a lot of times there isn't a straight line from one thing to another, and so I'm hoping in this conversation we can talk a little bit about where those barriers lie to, you know, even we know women shoulder a lot of stuff on the home front. They're cooking breakfast before, you know, getting kids out the door. You know, a lot of times cooking in other places is a lot more than just, you know, putting on a tea kettle. It's more labor intensive. What are the opportunities, and how does political participation and increased participation help communities? And then what is the role of other people? So we throw a lot on the shoulders of women these days, don't we? We hear a lot about how women are the key to unlocking the potential of girls and education and community benefits. And, you know, I work on environmental issues also, and now, you know, climate change, it's, you know, the women are going to save the day. And so what is the role for others in the community to step up and to support these efforts? So I'm really excited to talk a little bit further. I want to introduce our great panelists, starting with Anna Banks, who is at Fair Trade USA. And Anna has a fascinating background in the private sector, working on e-commerce for Walmart and working as her own consultancy with her own business supporting businesses, and has transitioned to this sector, and we'll be very interested in hearing her insights. Then we have Dar Vanderbeck, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at CARE and who has worked previously for Teach for America and has a background in social innovation. Then Maura Ball, who is the Associate Director of Women's Economic Empowerment Food Systems, and who has a background in finance and development, and Maura's with Oxfam. So thank you all. There are extended bios in your packet somewhere, so if you want to learn a little bit more. But I'm going to start off with an opening question for each of the panelists. And I will start off here with Anna. So women's economic empowerment has lots of benefits. It's the right thing to do, but it also has some really happy outcomes also. So can you talk about the impact that you're seeing from your organization's work in this area?
Sure. And can you all hear me? Yeah, space age mic thing. So the first thing I wanted to start to talk about was just empowerment overall. Empowerment is a really important concept for fair trade, and it's a big piece of how Fair Trade USA kind of differentiates the way that it delivers its benefit. And we think of empowerment as feeling heard and the opportunity to speak up, which sounds super basic, but I'm going to tell you how that gets pretty complicated. In many of the environments that we work in, this idea of women's economic empowerment is way more complex than it seems, especially when you're in environments where the structures are such that, especially when you're working with a market-driven economy, getting the dollars into those women's hands is more challenging than it sounds like. Because you're dealing with structures where the majority of, say, for example, land ownership is structured around men. And land ownership is the access to decision-making bodies, it's access to being in a room where these decisions are made or dollars getting into people's hands. The other piece is around when you're talking about a market economy where women may be doing the majority of the harvesting, but it's men who take that crop in to be sold, and therefore the ones who get the actual dollars into their hands after it is sold, and then the dollars don't somehow make it all the way back home to the family. Like we hear stories of like half the money got spent on alcohol before it actually made it back to the family. And so the control of the dollars are often in male hands, and it's not as easy as it sounds like to get into women's hands in the first place. So that's what I wanted to start off with. So one of the ways that Fair Trade has addressed this is by creating structures that are really focused around incentivizing gender equity. And so what do I mean by that? So the Fair Trade model is focused on certifying farms, factories, fisheries around the globe against social, economic, and environmental standards. And the little piece on top of it is by participating in the program, there are incremental dollars that go back to that workforce. So if it's a factory, it's an incremental like 1% to 2% over whatever the order is that is intended to go directly to those workers. Or if it's on a farm, it's a number of cents per pound that are specifically for that farm. So the way that we have structured it though is for that workforce to take advantage of those dollars, they have to set up something that's called a Fair Trade Committee. And that committee is the one that decides and will implement how those dollars are spent. So here's where the difference comes in. We say for this committee, we require that it reflect the workforce that is actually going to be using the money. So therefore, if 50% of the workforce is women, 50% of that leadership committee must be women if you are actually going to access this dollar. So one, implementing like designated leadership roles for men. Then number two, to be able to spend the dollars, we require the community votes on how that money is going to be spent. So every person in that workforce casts a vote for like, how do I feel this money would be best spent in my community? Again, if you're requiring that it's representative of the workforce, by default you are giving women a vote in how that money is spent. So what does that mean as a result? When you look at the ways these incremental dollars, the community development funds, are spent in the communities, they are very different than you might see if you didn't allow them to participate in how those are spent. So you see it going towards things like daycares, hospitals, and a couple of anecdotal examples to talk about. So In India specifically, they put their money towards daycare so that women who are going to work every day have a place to leave their kids with, feel like it's safe, the kids are being educated, and they're being fed during the year. So their premium went to not just build the daycare, but to continue to fund it so that women have that balance. In Ecuador, women would work all week, and then on Sundays would spend all day washing their clothes in the river. And so that community voted to spend their premium dollars towards washing machines so that women would be able to spend more time with their families rather than spending all day Sunday washing clothes. And then the third one is in India around cooking stoves, where women were, and we talked about basic domestic responsibilities taking way longer than we are used to in our environment. They opted for stoves so that they would be able to execute meals much more quickly rather than having to get up at 4 in the morning to get things done before going to the factory to spend all day. So the long and the short is when you give women the voice around how these dollars are spent, they're going to spend it in ways that benefit their families and their communities.
And it's interesting how you're kind of baking this into the structure of how money is spent in just the programs by Fair Trade. So great, well, thank you. Dar, what are you seeing? What is the impact that you're seeing in your work?
Yeah, first off, thank you for having me here. It's my third time in Seattle. This view is only a little bit distracting to me, so you see me just kind of gazing out. That's what I'm doing. I think it would be cool to start with the framing of the structure, right? That this, I think so much of the framing around women's economic empowerment has been this fairly patriarchal framing. Give a woman $1 and the world will improve. And I think we can imagine a society that's far more just, radical, and bold than that. As a really quick example, CARE has we're really proud of a methodology called the Village Savings and Loans Association. It started in Niger in 1990, and it was 12 million women a part of it. One of the interesting stories, though, in Uganda is that we saw these incredible gains happening in terms of access to capital, decision-making, access to land rights, and we also saw skyrocketing examples of intimate partner violence. So when we talk about what it means or the end goal of women's economic empowerment, I think it's important to ground it in a vision for a world where everyone, no matter of their gender, race, class, where they were born, what their body is capable of, has a role to live a life in dignity. It's a very important component of changing those structures, and I think we'll get into that later. But I think keeping our kind of North Star set on really what we're working towards is a important distinction. So yeah, just thank you
for that. Yeah, some of the framing, we frame some of these programs around all of the benefits that women can provide everybody else rather than this is just the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, it's one other addition there too is when we talk even about women's empowerment, we make invisible who is doing the empowering or what is doing the empowering. And I think that that's a real dance between the deeply personal act of saying that you have a role to play, there's a seat for you in the world, and also being able to have the enabling environment to change those structures, to cultivate leadership, to change policy. And I know we'll get into all of that too, but yeah.
Maura, what are you seeing?
Welcome. Oh, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can? Am I on?
Is there a green light?
No. There is a red light. Well, there is a green light. So welcome to the best panel ever, as far as I'm concerned. And who made me go last? But fine. So hi, I'm Maura Ball, Associate Director of Women's Economic Empowerment. Let me briefly introduce Oxfam because we don't always do that. So Oxfam is a global social justice organization that operates in 90 countries around the world, working to end the injustice of poverty. So we do that by helping people build better futures for themselves, by helping them hold the powerful accountable, and by saving lives in disasters. So my job in the Women's Economic Empowerment team is to advance structures that allow for a transformation, including one of the structures or one of the methods that we use is also women's savings groups. Our program's called Saving for Change, and a lot of the examples that I'll be talking about today draw from our experience with Saving for Change. So you probably know the core components, but the process of setting up the savings group itself is a lot about establishing a woman's agency and dignity and intellectual contribution. The women are self-select to participate, groups of like 15 to 20 women. And they set up themselves the terms and conditions upon which they're going to save, what the interest rates are going to be, the size of the loans, who's going to get the loan. And these become little institutions that are owned by the women themselves. And it requires very little external, virtually no external money. There isn't any external money. This money that's saved is all women's savings themselves. It can be as little as 20 cents. In some countries, as much as $5 a session in other countries. And the only outside support is really training on the methodology and then keeping up with the groups. But to your question, on the multiple benefits of women's economic empowerment besides household income, I wanted to tell a story about going to Guatemala about 5 years ago. And I met a woman who was a participant in a women's savings group in Guatemala, and what she told me was that before she joined the savings group, she had never said her name out loud because there was no need. Everyone she met and interacted with knew her. She lived an exclusively private and sheltered existence, and one in which she was in service of the people around her. She had no public persona. It still gives me shivers thinking about that. In addition to that anecdote is that I think she was nicknamed the Tiger by her group after a few years of participation in the group. It was a tiger. And this is an anecdote, but it's reflective of what we see in the research and the evidence that we've gathered. At Oxfam, we spend a lot of money and time gathering evidence of impact. There's a new research publication on our work in Mali that we've shared through Global Washington that showed that what women value the most in their participation in the savings groups is the fact that their participation increases their ability to express themselves. So literally, these programs liberate and free voice. They attributed that capacity directly to their participation in the groups, and they also said that it didn't stop in the groups, right? It also contributed to their ability to negotiate with their partners, to express their desires at a household level, to increase their decision-making power at household level, and to claim their roles in their communities and in political settings. The income is transitory, right? It can come and go. But that kind of a shift internally, that's what sustainable development is from my perspective. I'll read a quote from the same research report, which I am in love with. And most research reports are like, okay, this one, no, you have to read. It's amazing. It's a page turner. And one of the participants said, the word is liberated. Before Saving for Change, I could barely express myself in front of more than 3 people. But over the years, my experience in the group as president and further training gave me the confidence to realize my opinion has value. How many women here haven't been in situations where you think, right now, I feel like my opinion doesn't have value? You can't put a dollar sign on that. My opinion has value. I may not be literate, so this one wasn't literate, but I ran as a candidate in municipal elections last year, and I'll run again next year, right? IFPRI research showed that women's disempowerment results from a lack of group participation, lack of control over income, and discomfort speaking in public. What women's economic empowerment can do at its best, when it's programmed really intentionally, it can support financial stability, social support, and voice.
Wow, thank you for that. I want to bring it back to Anna. You touched on just kind of how you're, at Fair Trade, you're kind of looking at structures that you put in place to kind of even the playing field and include women in decision-making. What are the roles of other people in the community, and how do we engage them to kind of spur this change?
Yeah, there are two areas that I want to talk about with this one. And the first one is around safe spaces, to Dar's comment around making sure women feel safe. And the second one is around domestic relief. So starting with safe spaces. So in the beginning, I talked about how Fair Trade tries to structure it to encourage women to create a space where women can have a leadership role and to make sure that their voice is heard in how the money is being spent. The challenge is, how do you make sure that that's actually even happening? And so one of the things that we do is, for every location that's Fair Trade certified, we actually go around and we do a survey, and we ask all of the workers in each of the locations. And that, again, is another thing that's a little more complex than it sounds. So one of the things that we have to do when we do our surveys is, one, we make sure people are being interviewed in their native language. And two, making sure that women are being interviewed by other women. So why does that matter? So you start to ask women questions about, like, do you feel respected by your supervisor? Do you agree with how the money is being spent in your cooperative? Have you ever made a complaint or suggestion to your co-op or fair trade committee in the last 12 months? So you are asking women to contribute their voice. And often for many women, for the first time, anyone's even asked their opinion. But I bring this up because when you create this environment, things come out that you didn't necessarily expect. And we have an example in Mexico where we were specifically asking women around, like, do you feel, in your opinion, does your supervisor respect you? And in that dialogue, it came out that there was some systematic sexual harassment that was going on at this particular farm, which would not have come out otherwise. But because it was a safe space, this was aired, and women never would have thought to bring this up if, one, they didn't feel they were safe, and two, they didn't feel like it was going to be addressed once it was brought up. So this creation of safe spaces to create this environment, I think that's number one on the structural piece. So number two was around domestic relief, and we touched on this a little bit in the beginning. So a little anecdote, a couple days ago, I was in the kitchen of our office and I was commiserating with another coworker, and we were like, how in the world can you get home at 6 o'clock with kids in tow and get dinner on the table in a reasonable amount of time? And in this day and age, all we women here struggle with this, and we have running water, we have machines to wash our clothes and wash our dishes, we have processed food. I have a fairly supportive spouse who does all the laundry. Like, we have all these things around us, and yet we're struggling. So now let's get out of our own little bubble, and let's go to a woman who has to walk for miles just to get clean water for her family to cook. Where prepping meals for her family is something that takes hours, and she's doing this before she's heading off to work for a full day, or working with a baby strapped on her back all day, like standing for hours. And then we're going to say, okay, well, why isn't she involved in the political process? Maybe because she's got two jobs that she is like burdening. So this sort of double life that women are leading, we gotta figure out how to fix that, right? Or how to get some relief. So that's why I said number two is this domestic relief. If you want women to participate in this process, you gotta figure out that balance. So even with things like the Fair Trade Committee, where a woman who is remote and rural, to get to the committee, she's got to travel. Guess what? That costs money. She may not have the disposable income to get her to that meeting and back. So that's problem number one. Number two, who's watching the kids while she's at the meeting? This is still her problem. So figuring out how to enable her to be able to get there and participate in the process are like basic things we've got to solve first before we start to figure out how we get women involved.
I I mean, just the note that, it's a barrier and also it's like her problem to solve, right? Nobody's gonna jump in and be like, oh, I'll take the kids, no problem, She's gotta figure that out. Dar, so we're talking about increasing women's participation. How does this lead to kind of larger structural change and larger advocacy movements?
Cool, and I actually realized that my anecdote, especially in Uganda, around the intimate partner violence, I forgot the punchline to it, which is that we worked with a husband circle, so of men and boys. And I bring that up just because sometimes we can talk about safe space, so to be on the nose about it, we need to reimagine what masculinity means in this world. And specifically, we can't just, turn up the volume on our voice if we're not saying who is listening, who still has power right now, and how are they giving up power. And I think one of the, memes in some way that's been going around, but is an old adage of social justice work, is that if you're not used to equality, it can feel like oppression. So transforming creating the enabling environment for men, for boys, to actually think and evolve what it means to be a man is extremely important. And some of the most powerful work, I mentioned the work in Uganda. We also have a really incredible program called Be a Man Initiative in the Balkans, which is a school-based, solidarity group that's redefining what the dreams are for being a man. And I'm, very much giving into the binary right now, so I'll just name that. But I think it is when we talk about a theory of change, of working with what structures we have now to create transformation, it's important to acknowledge. In terms of the broader structural piece, so I'll give an example of our work in Niger. And again, when you were describing Oxfam, I'm like, oh wow, Kara's and Oxfam very similar. I also work in 95 countries and work for social justice, providing humanitarian relief and defeating poverty. So one of, I think, really positive deviant programs is started in 1990, as I mentioned. It's a group savings program. But one of the interesting things that I think we've evolved in our research in the last few years has been looking at the outcomes. So 13% of women in Niger between the ages of 15 and 64 are a part of the Village Savings and Loans group. So the penetration is really profound. A third of women in political office in Niger have come from the Village Savings and Loans groups. And the third piece, which I think is important to name, is that us as an international NGO call them Village Savings and Loans groups, which is kind of prioritizing the credit piece of it and the savings and the economic angle of it. But in Niger, it translates to ingenious women. And that name for the savings groups, there's over 22,000 of them nationwide, is a collective. What we see is that people say, I came for the savings and I stayed for the solidarity. So it's not just an easy line to say, okay, we come and there's an incredible process around group decision making, but there's something potentially more profound that I think emerges. And one is the experiencing being a part of governing, transparency, power, solidarity, building a collective identity. And so I think that is one area where we see the outcomes are numerous, and CARE doesn't create those outcomes. We're a supporter. I think one of the really fascinating things that we've seen in outcome interviews over the last 2 years was participants saying the biggest thing that CARE contributed was actually the training on political consciousness raising. So it wasn't actually the box, and I think from the sector, right, we can get focused on the things. There's a savings box, there's 3 keys, money goes in it. But how did that actually transform what you think is possible? How did that open up different levels of dialogue, like the example in Uganda with the husband circle, of saying, this is how we're brokering a new world. So that's one example I'll share there.
Thank you. Maura, so hearing these stories, there's a bit of a narrative of some isolation, right? Women living a little bit in isolation, even though they're surrounded by communities, and then just their own sphere of influence and how that might grow. Can you just talk about or give some examples of what you have seen in terms of economic empowerment leading to increased agency and more political participation?
Definitely. So I couldn't agree with both of you more. These women are geniuses.
And genius not.
And genius women, exactly. Let's start our own group right here. So some examples that have moved me particularly have been in Guatemala, where 20,000 women are organized in savings groups. They are, right now, some women are participating from those savings groups in leadership development programs, and women coming from those leadership development programs have advanced legislation that's before Parliament now, that's looking to overcome many of the barriers that are still legislatively enshrined, and creating incentives for greater women's participation, such as rules around credit access, land rights, and agricultural extension services. And in Mali, where 500,000 women are organized into savings groups, we've seen examples where, so in Mali, it is culturally, women's land ownership is culturally prohibited. Yet, we've seen in 3 regions where women have used their collective power in order to obtain collective land ownership. That is stunning in terms of her ability women's ability to have independence and resources for the future. So what I'd say in terms of the linkage is that women's economic empowerment doesn't necessarily lead to political engagement. Rather, what I'd say is that women's economic empowerment is a prerequisite to political engagement. There are many barriers that keep women from being financially stable to engaging in a political setting, and I can talk about those if you're interested. But I think when women's economic empowerment programming is intentional, then what you see is an increase in her own ability to speak that's driven by the participation in the sport of the collective and basic financial security that makes her feel like she can go forward. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you think about it, right? You have to address kind of the immediate base needs before you can attend to higher order needs. But women's economic empowerment can enable political engagement when women feel that they have financial stability, that they have social support, and that they have voice.
Thank you. So I have a couple kind of wrap-up questions before we head into Q&A, so start thinking about your questions. My next question for all of you is, what has surprised you in working in this field, working on these issues? What aha moments, etc.? Anna?
Yeah. And I'll even throw in there, I think you'd asked us, how optimistic are we around how all of this is going to get itself solved? And I'll combine that with the aha
Yes.
moments. So often I feel like we are an eyedropper in the ocean in what we're doing. And I think the other folks on the panel, I'm sure you've had this feeling as well, like you know that you're doing the right thing, but you will be somewhere and you'll just be like, oh my goodness, everything is just so messed up.
Yeah.
And is what we're doing even making the least bit of difference? And there are many moments like that. And then we look at places where we have worked and we've discovered that models like fair trade, when we are working with cultural environments that already are starting to see the seeds of democracy, or there's some level of kind of egalitarian kind of nature to the culture that's there already, we have infinitely more success. So we are able to like basically kind of stick our toe in the door that's a little bit open, where people are already starting to see opportunity around like how women can be more kind of enable and empowering them in the environment. And that's where we see more success around things like, you know, getting women's leadership on committees and voting, et cetera. So then what's surprised me? So if we have this challenge where, you know, we're only really able to make huge inroads in the places where the country is culturally ready, and there are places where it's truly not culturally ready, and we have way less, we will readily admit, we have way less success there, where systems are truly patriarchal and the position of women is just not at a place where we can really make progress. Like, how do you have hope? And so that leads to the last piece of your question is like, we run into these places where the ingenuity of women it's startling, and it's just really amazing and just really breaks through. And I'll give you a couple of examples. You mentioned Mali, where women are not allowed to have land ownership. We work in Cote d'Ivoire, which is another place where the majority of land ownership, it's more or less culturally designated that it's only men who own the land. And we interacted with a coffee farmer, a woman who said that her husband had given her a portion of his land for her to farm on her own. And this had led to kind of a complete transformation of like her basically economic situation, because here she's farming her own land, she's taking her crops into be sold, she is able to get the dollars from that crop herself, and that like led to her feeling like she was way more empowered. She now then joined the co-op that she was involved in. She had a leadership role in that particular, so it was like this virtuous cycle that all started with her having this own piece of land that was hers, that she now had complete control over. So that was one. And then the second one is a much bigger one, is around the brand Cafe Femenino. Anybody familiar with Cafe Femenino? I see some nodding up here. So in 2004, there's a woman named Isabel Uriarte. She was in Ecuador. And she saw that when you looked at the schools, if you looked at K1, 2, you still saw boys and girls who were in school. You got up to the 5th grade, all the girls are gone. What happened? All the girls are getting pulled out to go and work. And so she said, I've got to figure out a way to fix this. And so she tried to set up a co-op and was completely unsuccessful. So she started an NGO and said, my thing is going to be around girls' education, around getting more girls in school longer, because this is really important. And so she actually wound up eventually partnering with an importer and getting a co-op started focused around coffee farmed specifically and positioned as a brand as coffee farmed by women, and that the money goes directly to women. And this started with like one co-op in Ecuador, and now has expanded to 10 to 15 countries around the globe, and they're having trouble keeping up with demand. Like this positioning of coffee by and for women has really been empowering for those communities. So now you go back to this thing around education, and this has like this wonderful knock-on effect. You have girls who are staying in past 5th grade, and then they're actually going on to college. And in these environments, that creates a completely different playing field for their ability to participate in this economy. So, for example, there are roles that completely would have been out of the realm for women if they were not able to get kind of a more professional kind of learning in, let's say, the coffee industry in particular. So now you have women who are able to take a role in logistics, or they're able to be a Q grader, highly skilled role in this particular environment, or be a part of commercial sales. Like these are roles that would not be open to women and are major decision-making roles, but unless you were able to keep women in that kind of educational track, those roles are not accessible to them. And they all are now, this is starting to happen, all because one woman decided like, I gotta figure out how I can get more women to stay in school a little bit longer, and she's kind of started this like revolution that's leading to more women in the professional space in these industries. So when you hear stories like that, you're just like, yeah, okay, baby, it's not hopeless. Like, it's gonna be okay.
Okay, so where do we buy Cafe Feminino?
Yeah, so it's all over the place. So
It is.
just look it up. It's Cafe Feminino
At a grocery store?
at a grocery store, on Amazon.
All right.
Support them.
Okay, now we know. Thank you for the tip. Yeah, let's move right down the line then.
All right.
And so the question again for everybody is, what has surprised you working on this? What keeps you optimistic? Are you optimistic? What do you think?
Optimism, a little too soon to tell, just like the French Revolution on that one. But I think for what surprises me, this moment surprises me tremendously. And I spend a lot of time thinking about, in an era of Me Too, Time's Up, this incredible reckoning that we're feeling in the United States, but globally. There's so much energy in the system. There's so much kind of awakening happening, consciousness raising. I didn't think when I graduated college that there would be, well, first of all, that there would be BuzzFeed at all, but that would be, BuzzFeed articles about like the top 10 ways to leverage your privilege, or how to be a more intersectional feminist. And so I think it's important to acknowledge just the power of this moment right now. I think of two things. One is that if there's one lesson from, let's say, I don't know, after 2016, it's that the unimaginable is ordinary. That this is also a moment of wild possibility. And I think that in a lot of ways it's questioning how we think new worlds are born, realities are created. I grew up in the United States, and I think in the US we have a very legal framework for things often. We think about ratifying change, but when things make it to the White House or to Congress, that is just ratifying a world that people have been working for a very long time to create. So I've been thinking a lot about it, and I think something that gives me incredible hope is how we widen that aperture. So to butcher a Rebecca Solnit quote, it's something around that, the future doesn't come from the main stage. It comes from off stage, it comes from the periphery. So how do we as practitioners of social change and gender justice widen our aperture to find where are the seedlings of that new world, and how do we invest in those? How do we support those? I have the honor of working at CARE, and with like all of our organizations, it's an awesome, truly, I feel awe at getting to contribute every day to have this vessel for impact. But I think we're at this moment where we're seeing a lot more people, organizations come out of the woodwork. It's an all hands on deck moment. I have a good friend who works on climate change issues and just wrote a book called Project Drawdown, which I'm sure many of us have heard of. And I think one of the most provocative points of that book is to say, or to ask the question, can we dismantle, or can we reverse climate change without dismantling the patriarchy? So a lot of the things, we can have these little solutions, in projects, and those are so important, but how do we actually seriously engage in the process of imagining a new world? And then figuring out who we are as practitioners, what privilege we have, what tables we're seated at, where we can start kind of tipping the scales in that direction and enabling that. So I think I'm hopeful, and I'm excited to be in the fight. Potentially not yet optimistic. And I think in general, just this, I feel like every day I wake up I am genuinely surprised again what is happening. So I guess the question is how to metabolize that deep surprise.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think, I moderated a panel at the Global Washington Conference last fall, and part of the question was, we're doing great work, we're working on women's issues, but we still have a long way to go, even in our own sector, in workplaces, and lots of other factors about women working in development. And so, we're already working on, or need to work on, some stuff here at home while we're working on these really important issues. So we get double the work. Hooray for us, huh? All right.
But we're used to it.
We are, aren't we? So Maura, what has surprised you working on this? What makes you hopeful? Are you optimistic?
So I do think that the cutting edge is around freeing men to become their whole selves, just as we want to free women to become their whole selves. One really profound moment that I had at Oxfam was working with an intern from Bangladesh who'd done a lot of work in trying to prevent sexual harassment on college campuses at home. And she would say, don't you see how bad the patriarchy, how bad toxic masculinity is for men? It's poison. And that made me realize the kind of count, in a way, like a jigsaw puzzle piece of the people that are powerful have to relinquish power. But on the other hand, if the power isn't working well for you, if it's cancerous and brings you to a place that you actually don't want to be, then we all have the same objective. But men have to be invited and celebrated for making those changes and not castigated as they are in some societies when they take on more care work or whatever it is. In terms of optimism, I don't skew optimistic, and the past couple of years have not helped in that regard. That said, in preparing for this talk, I remembered vaguely a story that my mom had told me, and I asked her to recount it to me again, and I said, wasn't there something about when you got married and dad and voting or something? And she said, oh yeah. She was a recent immigrant to the US, and my dad had been here a bit longer, and 1964, and it was a presidential election, and he sat her down one day and said, so look, this is how you're gonna vote. And she said, why are you saying this to me? And he said, well, we were in church, and we got married, and you promised before God to honor and obey me, and didn't you realize that that included how you were gonna vote? So fast forward now, 55 years later, and we have Tuesday night, where we have the Sea of White, and we have at the State of the Union, and we have 102, a historic number of women serving in the House of Representatives, right? 55 years apart, but it's a world apart, so things can change, social norms can shift. The unimaginable can seem just every day to us now. So we have to empower women to lead and to make their own choices. Women's collective action and social movements are key to that. And it's universal. There's research, again, the Mali research, which I swear I'm not getting royalties from. It's just so good.
Sounds like the best research report ever.
So there's a quote in there where a woman participant, she had been part of the civic engagement exercise, which involved creating a theatrical piece for local elected officials about the importance of clean water. And so they staged this theatrical piece, and what she said about that was, it was wonderful that they listened, but I think it would have been wonderful even if they hadn't, because putting that piece together made us learn to speak, and now we can't be quiet. I was at the Women's March in Boston how many weeks ago, and what did we start with? We started with that song from the singer Milk that rings, I can't be quiet. We are in this together, and that makes me really optimistic.
Thank you. What an inspiration. It was interesting because I was just assumed everybody was going to be wildly optimistic, and you guys kind of took a while to get there. And
Stuck the landing.
I think that this is the wrong year to ask that question. So I think we have a microphone that will be roaming around. I encourage you to ask questions. We don't have too much time before Abby comes up and gives some remarks, so have at it.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This was an amazing panel. I definitely inspired. So here's my question. My name is Laura Espriu. I'm Mexican Latina. I'm the founder of the biggest Latina professional circle here in Seattle. We over 400 Latinas. And it breaks my heart because at the beginning I created this circle because I wanted to help Latinas to get better opportunities here in Seattle. But then I realized I'm not even allowed to do that because a lot of them, they are not allowed to work even when they have like tons of years of experience, amazing credentials, but they don't even have a visa. So they are not allowed to work, and because of that, of course, they suffer from anxiety and depression. And then some of them are allowed to work, but then we have the problem that they don't have the credentials that you ask for that. For example, we have doctors, we have psychologists, we have so many different women, amazing, brilliant, and again, they are not allowed to work because of their lack of credentials. So my question is, what can I do? What can we do if there are some tools out there to help these Latinas to volunteer, to practice, do something, so we help them with that anxiety, with that depression, and polish their skills so when the opportunity comes and the visa comes, they are ready.
Great question. Anyone? Thoughts?
This is professional these are professional credentials.
Licenses.
Licenses.
Practice,
Well, I mean, I think, sister, I mean, you are laying the groundwork by convening them and right, I mean, I think what we've all talked about is the power of social capital. And what an isolating situation, right? I mean, to come here, to be in a new community, to suffer from feeling excluded from everything that you know, language barrier, etc. And by your bringing everybody together in a collective, I think that you're already making a huge difference just by building those connections. So, I mean, I think you're making a great start.
It still doesn't feel well.
I know.
Well, first off, just also thank you for sharing such inspiring work with us. That's where the change happens. So really amazing. Honored to be in your presence. I think one of the reflections, and take this or leave it, but from looking at the solidarity groups across CARE, has been these tried and true kind of community organizing principles around creating an environment where people can step into leadership, not like formal names, but really like claim a leadership, build community around that leadership, and then build power out of that community. And I think often when we think of solidarity groups, we forget that last step. You know, and that's like the book club model, right? It's like at some point you stop going if you're not really, you know, tapped into a power analysis and transforming and making momentum and building a sense of collective identity. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I think one of the learnings I'd say from CARE's work around powerful solidarity groups that are building that sense of collective identity and belonging while also advocating for broader change.
Yeah, I mean, the tiny thing I would add is to build on the network piece is, so the network of women, so huge kudos to you for putting that together. The next piece though is work on your ally network. Like, who are the people across the aisle, the people who are in like the privileged space, but who are sympathetic, empathetic? Get as many allies there and they can help open doors to help figure out how to make, like, give your network even more power and more legs. So finding the allies, like, right? It's not just about everyone in the room, it's about everybody who's in the right room, so.
Yeah.
Make a question up front.
Oh, is this on?
Yeah.
Good. Oh, this has been a great panel. I'm Anne Marie Kimball. I'm a physician. I've worked in most of the countries you guys have worked in. So, and mostly in the health sector as a physician and promoter of family planning and other maternal mortality issues. So my question comes from all that experience listening, because you guys are doing some very, very powerful work and I'm really, really impressed, and so thank you. My two questions are, you're all doing sort of similar things in financial savings and loans for women and access to capital. How much communication across your organizations are you able to have in country so that there may be combined banking groups or combined financial groups, or at least coordination so that women are members of one and maybe not the other, or whatever works. The second question is, in my experience, more difficult, and that is, in working with women, there are privileged women who are very well kept by their husbands and perfectly happy, often, with where they are in their society. And then there are women, as we've heard, who are not in that position. And I guess it's sort of the cross-class thing that in working with our family planning groups was extremely important to have both, if you could, the women in that position as well as the women, the working women, so that it sort of became socially okay for their husbands to make another choice, because it was okay for the men in the more elite positions to also have their wives make that choice. That may sound very patriarchal, but that was my experience, so that's my question.
I'll do a tweak on the first one. So around the collaboration between organizations, the answer is not enough. I mean, and I think all of us recognize it, and it's not, there's no malicious intent. I think everybody just kind of gets in their lane and gets going, and then often in country, it is very challenging for us to share with each other, because often what's going on in the country makes it challenging for us to either be sharing resources or people to communicate with each other. So I know on the fair trade side, we have made that a priority. How do we figure out who are other folks we should be collaborating with? Because you're right, we're all trying to do the same thing, so we should not be competing with each other. And we really should be doing a better job of figuring out how we can be leveraging each other's services.
Yeah, agree. You're right, the second question is so much harder. So I'll actually really just acknowledge and hear it back, because I think that this is one of, in the last response around what I'm hopeful for or surprised, I think we do have a moment to create a global community of people that are working for gender justice.
How much does funding come into this? I mean, we know that funding flows and how grants are made contribute to sometimes a lack of collaboration, because you got to just get what you need to get done.
Well, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want to go?
Oh, just
Have you seen the I'm sorry panel? Have you seen the Amy Schumer I'm sorry panel with the women apologizing to each other? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You go first. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You go first.
So sorry.
I just did it. You go first.
I'm sorry. One of the things I think that we're seeing is also philanthropy changing. At CARE, we're launching an initiative called Embark, which is a global gender justice collective. And we're working really deeply with a few philanthropists. We're going to announce it next month. It's going to be chaired by President Johnson Sirleaf. And one of the things I think that we're seeing is lots of these different collaborative funds or funding circles. Co-impact is a really loud example, but there's a lot of different models for us to structure philanthropy in a different way. That also, I think, as a part of that, acknowledges the power of proximity. So it's a little bit less interesting to have a funding circle that's still, let's say, all women in New York City making decisions about what's powerful. How do we actually, again, structure a fund to really devolve that responsibility to people that are most proximate to the problems we're trying to solve? Or Ayanna Pressman had a really great quote recently: those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. So how do we live that through, and how we structure our funds, how do we do our work, how we make decisions, how we govern, et cetera, I think is a broad global challenge right now. So that's just one.
So this woman is queen of the mic drop quotes, right? Am I right? Totally. So I just wanted to say that I think that in country that our organizations are beginning to respond to pressure from governments to be better coordinated, and we've seen that, I think, within the savings group environment, that there's, in certain countries, there's heightened coordination and acknowledgement of exactly the types of challenges you're talking about. And I can give you some of there's just recently research about it, I can give you some of those examples if you're interested. But so yes, not enough, but I think that I do think that there are environments where it's really working. And the other point, I was going to mention that yes, also worked on a women's economic empowerment initiative in Guatemala that was around women's entrepreneurship and creating cohorts of women entrepreneurs. And there you saw the very distinct difference in terms of class, not only class, but also ethnicity, and how bringing women together was, on the one hand, could be very supportive of internal change. It could also be divisive. So it's tricky because there were also circumstances in which some of the women who were coming from more marginalized communities didn't feel comfortable sharing. The trust building just took a lot longer. So I think you're getting to intersectionality, which I didn't know what that was, but when I started at Oxfam, and now you're like, what? You're not taking an intersectional approach? So I think that, we're getting better and smarter in terms of, so anyway, but the point being to look at that in terms of, and have kind of a plan in terms of how you're going to engender trust within groups, knowing that women are not homogenous, they're heterogeneous, and that needs to be taken into consideration.
Other questions? Right here?
Hi, my name is Janet Latawa, and I run an economic and leadership development program in the Pacific. We have run into a lot of challenges in our work. There's not really been programs to scale around economic development that have taken off. And we've had to be, as a small organization, in a position of pioneering a lot of things, which is really challenging and isolating in an area like the Pacific. But one of the things that I wonder, kind of at your levels of work, how it's filtering up, is there's so much discussion around these other impacts that happen for women when they participate in economic development programs. But as somebody who's working on the ground in remote communities, one of the biggest challenges I find is just getting support for the technical aspects of the work. We're an Oxfam partner in the Pacific, and I get a 75-page, I'm not picking on Oxfam, I'm just kidding, it's full story. You get a 75-page.
I think you're a care partner, right?
No, I was making jokes. I'm just gonna talk about Mike. But, there's a lot of discussion around, the do no harm reports and kind of larger, bigger picture impacts. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of what it takes to get women to actually earn enough to shift those gender norms, there's very little expertise to support us in that delivery. So we've really, it's basically because of my privilege to have access to another country and resources here that we've been able to get. I work in a cultural industries program, so we've been able to get a really great product designer to come and work with us, so that the women actually are selling enough products through us to earn enough to then shift those norms in their family, right? But if I go to your typical forum or discussion in the Pacific with about economic empowerment, it will be totally a discussion on gender, which obviously is, the integral point to all of this. But unless we do a good enough job as development practitioners around the actual economic earning side of this and the technical and trading side of this, I see that we don't actually have we don't give the women enough leverage in their communities as development practitioners. And it just feels constantly like a sort of emperor has no clothes on sort of environment where nobody's kind of calling that out. And there's not necessarily even people in the INGO circles, at least in the Pacific, that can provide technical support to us or are even aware of those inputs into our CERT program. So I'm just wondering, at your levels, and being, outside a lot of being in a very different center here in the U.S., what is that discussion? Are you guys aware of?
Yeah, so
this
can
dynamic?
I hop in on that one, at least just to start? Yeah, so this issue around living wage is a huge one for fair trade, of course. And especially since our model is not necessarily to try and mess around with the literal payment of the individual thing that people are being compensated for, which is a real challenge. So we have to kind of affect it from the other side. So we have to support the research around what is a living wage in the particular countries around the globe. Right, so we work with the ILO, we work with ICEAL to figure out what is that calculation around what is a living wage, because it's a very contentious and very kind of complicated calculation around what is living wage, because it has to take into account like how much does it cost to actually live in your particular place, how much does food cost, how much does rent cost, like what does that look like, what are the expenses in that particular space, to come up with what the living wage is, and then calculate that over to, let's say if it's a factory, what should really be the hourly wage that somebody is being paid in order to connect with that living wage. So it's a very complicated, messy space that even Fair Trade, we have to partner with other folks who are specializing in that research behind what is a living wage in each individual country. And then the best we can do is kind of advocate for that, and encourage organizations like, hey, it's here, can you figure out how to structure the way your things are operating to get closer to that living wage, to make sure the folks who are in the program are getting the money they need to survive. So I wanted to call that first. So there are many organizations who are doing that research, and I think that's because they are so established around the globe, that can be an anchoring point for you to try to figure out where should you be advocating for at a minimum.
That's great response. I'll add two quick things, because what I'm hearing is also a pain point around kind of the distance between doing that really frontline community change work and the INGO, or the big global infrastructure. I just want to make sure I'm kind of narrowing in on that part of your question. So I think this is something that I think we're all seized with in different ways. So, at CARE, we have a program called Scale by Design, which is essentially an accelerator, but it's trying to, and it's not perfect, but what it's trying to solve for is that we have such incredible work at the project level that is created and led by local civil society organizations, social enterprises, et cetera. How do we collaborate more? Because we're so, really to your point, Anne-Marie, as well, we're so values aligned, actually. It's just that grunt work of figuring out how to work together, how to leverage, for example, the incredible assets of Fair Trade and Oxfam and CARE as this global network that has access. I'm sure someone from all of our organizations went to Davos, or these fora, right, that are very different, and how we connect that down. I think for me, that's the future of this work, is what does it look like to be a global constellation of social change actors that then can be knitted together by a values agreement, if that's a brand or an organization, I don't know. But I just wanted to acknowledge, I think the pain point you described is something that everyone is variously taken by and trying to solve for at a structural level.
And I think I'd like to understand a little bit better, we can do that offline in terms of specifically what's happening, but I think a little bit of what you're getting to is what I've seen as a bifurcation in technical expertise and support between those who specialize in economics and finance and kind of economic development, and those who specialize in gender justice issues, and that women's economic empowerment can fall betwixt and between, where you have technical staff who aren't necessarily incentivized to reach across the aisle to provide the type of support that I think you're looking for. And I think that's been a structural deficiency of the sector. And you see the same thing in terms of gender-based violence not being recognized as an issue in women's economic empowerment work for an embarrassingly long time. I think we're getting better, but probably not fast enough for your purposes. But I do think that this type of conversation is evidence of kind of where we've come since I started this work. But and I think it depends on the country offices, how they're organized, and who you're networked to. So I think if we could, I think I need a little bit more time to understand exactly what you're confronted with to get a better answer.
I mean, it is true, these are very different, community building and, facilitating groups and getting people together, and then the whole other side of economics and jobs and workforce and that sort of thing, really different. And this is kind of where they come together
And it tends to be sort of a tricky bit with hiring people and who have both skill sets and then where they fit into a country office environment. I have personal experience with that where it did not go particularly well. So yeah, I think it can be challenging. I think it's going to look different in a few years, but again, that's not fast enough for your purposes.
All right, so one lightning round, final question. We have one right up in front here.
Mine is more a continuation of her question. Maybe you guys could talk a little bit more about decision-making in the home as it relates to economic empowerment and women's empowerment, because I think one of the things that I heard in your question was, how much money do they have to make until there's an actual change in the power dynamics in the family, but it's not just financial. And there may be some things that you could glean from this group around how to integrate decision-making and power dynamics in the home beyond just the actual earning.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the low-hanging fruit in terms of development work that focuses on women in general is negotiation training. That it comes up over and over again. We just did a study on reproductive health and rights awareness in Mali, where we found that 70% of women assume that men have the decision-making power about whether or not she uses various reproductive methods or what her reproductive health methods will be. So I don't know that there's a dollar value when we look at Saving for Change. Some women are saving 10 cents a week. I think it's about the transformative experience of going from a place where you're exclusively an economic dependent. I mean, basically your child, right? You're a burden. To a place where you don't feel like a burden anymore, where you save some money, where you have other people that you can go to. You don't have to ask your husband for money if you have to go on a medical appointment. So we see so many different amounts of money that women save and get to a place of transformation. And then I think when that's done with training that's around rights awareness, but then also takes into consideration that you are effectively participating in a rebalancing of power, and to plan for that so women can be planful, men can be involved, brought into the conversation, so that they're supportive of the transformation that their partners are going through. I don't think there is an amount of money, but there's not like an elasticity in terms of the amount of money that's required.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that especially there's not going to be one answer. It's going to be a completely different answer depending on the country, right? So it's going to completely vary by the level of development. So number one, there's not just one answer, but then the one answer, I think Maura, you really called it out. It is, when does a woman feel like that there is that balance of power shifts, such that she is not a dependent, that she is able to make some decisions and have some control over how these, that's the point. When is there enough money that she's not so busy kind of scrapping around oh my goodness, where is the next meal gonna come from for my family? When do they get past that? Wherever that point is, that's where it is. And that's gonna be a completely different place in Colombia than it is in India and than it is in Ivory Coast.
Thank you, guys. So I think we need to wrap up. So I want to thank you all for this genius panel. As an added bonus, we found out about a new coffee brand that we want to buy. We found out that Dar has more mic drop quotes than we could ever imagine, and that Maura is in possession of the hottest research report to womankind. So thank you guys all, really appreciate it. Join me in a round of applause.
close
Yes.
to clap.
What a privilege to be with this group in this panel today and talking about all the things that I know we all care about very deeply. And, you know, just the questions were wonderful as we got to issues about power and grassroots and grass tops. How do we really make change and how do we have hope and make this a real tipping point moment, given all that's going on around us. And let me just start with a bit of where this panel began. And thanks, Anna, for kind of highlighting empowerment, feeling heard, and the opportunity to speak up. What does that really mean? And when we talk about women's economic empowerment, and over decades, the various methodologies, group lending, solidarity groups, the examples you heard today through the village savings and loan methodology, the savings for change, and so forth. Some of the things that give me hope. 30-some years ago, I remember I was a community development and agriculture extension worker in Southern Africa, and hearing some quotes and data when we talked about women in development, remember WID? And the quote that stopped me in my tracks was, women do 80% of the world's work and own less than 1% of the world's resources. Now here we are. A lot of change has happened and a lot hasn't happened at the scale and pace we need. Today, we know, and Oxfam released a report just recently as part of a global Even It Up campaign focusing on inequality, that 9 of every 10 billionaires are men. 86% of companies around the world are run by men. And this isn't about a zero-sum game. It's not about taking power away or someone loses or someone gains. We know we continue to need real change at all levels to make real change happen and get to this elusive but within reach tipping point. So when these solidarity methodologies were happening in Niger, in Mali, and elsewhere 30-some years ago and 20 years ago, there wasn't necessarily a safe space then to talk about voice, political and civic participation. We used the entry point, the safe space, about social and economic empowerment. So some of the things that have really, really changed is some of the things we've learned and been able to share and show today and in our work at all levels. That we can see and thus prove and thus convince that there are not only social and economic benefits to giving women access to resources, but political and civic participation and voice actually can contribute to positive social change at the local level that is not threatening. We all know, we've known this, and we have to kind of keep proving it over and over, that when women have voice and choice about how decisions are made at the household level, that families and communities are healthier and wealthier. Everybody wins. The whole boat rises. Men aren't losing power, they're gaining it. But we are working in 90, 95, hundreds of countries around the world, including here in our very own country, the United States, where there's a lot to do to really change and shift power dynamics and social norms. In some other data that I can share with you, I do want to bring it home to the United States as well. And some of the issues that came up in the question and answers. What can we do? We see some of the great work happening at the local levels for women's income and voice, the savings and loan, and the economic empowerment and benefits thereof. But we also know that to really create impact at scale is to get at the policy issues and make real change there here in the United States and around the world. So if you look at some of the data here in the US, we do a commitment to reducing inequality index study every year where we, at Oxfam, collects data on 153 countries where data actually exists and it's reliable enough to make decisions or to do analysis. And looking at three particular items around what the drivers are and where real change can happen at the policy arena to create a more equal and just world. And it's about labor rights, which came up earlier, and it's not just, it's about living wage and dignified work, both here in the US and some of the examples that came up. Social services, how do countries invest in social services that of course benefit everybody? If women and children have access to education and health services, we know and we see, and the data shows, and I'll tell you where the US stands in a moment. And then the less sexy topic, progressive tax and transparency and about accountability around tax systems. But in this commitment to reducing inequality index, not surprisingly, Denmark this year is number 1, Nigeria is at the bottom. Any guesses where the United States is? Well, 23rd, but at the very bottom of G7 countries in all these 3 areas: social services and social spending, labor rights, and progressive tax. That the consumers are paying more of the taxes, and we know that some of the things around tax reform are troubling trends in this country. And at the bottom of the OECD countries as well. And so as we look at how are we going to get to tipping point and make real change, the work and the learning that has been going on from Uganda to Guatemala and in the Pacific, it's not about longer papers and getting a 75-page paper in one's hand to make change happen. We have to continue the work around voice and choice and income and voice. And we have to tackle the issues at the policy level. So what can we do? We all need to keep doing our work. We need to coordinate and collaborate better. Thanks for some of the questions which really point that out. And we can all continue to work together on the policy advocacy change that can make real change happen. We know that when the US's policies, and the US plays a leadership role in global policy change, it has a positive cascading effect around the world. And so when we look at these issues about social spending, about labor rights, living wage, which actually when we did our study and looked across the 50 states, not just in the US and not just countries, Washington fares very relatively well, Washington State, in the living, the dignified work category. But we also have experiences, someone we work with in Mississippi, on the poultry work we do. And there's a woman named Dolores who tells her story about what it means to work in undignified conditions. And Dolores, who goes to work every day, has gone to work in the past, and the speed of the production chain has required her and her fellow employees to wear diapers to work because there's no time to take a bathroom break. That can't be okay. And so we have to look at how we look at the social and economic empowerment lenses that these wonderful examples of change around the world have done, but we also need to look at the issues of dignified work and about just living wages. What is a just living wage, to your point, Anna? So there's so much we can do. I do have hope because of moments like these. This is about building movements, expanding alliances, and making global change, and women and men engaging and participating to make that change happen. So thanks again to Global Washington, and Kristen, thank you and everybody here at the Seattle Foundation for hosting us today.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you to all our panelists and Teresa for moderating. Thank you all for coming. As we're talking about enabling and empowering women around the globe to have agency and have a voice, just remember you all have a voice.